We are headed into the round of 16 this weekend. The international event has always brought in millions of viewers from around the world, but the women's tournament is still in its relative infancy, at least according to our next guest. FIFA only began hosting the women's soccer tournament in 1991. That makes this tournament just the ninth one. In 2019, 1.1 billion people watched the broadcast. This year, it's only expected to increase as a coverage of the event is also increased. Let's bring in Wells Fargo international economist Brendan McKenna to discuss the economics of this event. Brendan, you've put out a really interesting report around the economics of the Women's World Cup, but let's start by talking about just how long this has been going on. 1991 is what we said. Compare that with 1930, which is when the men's game began. Talk about the changes we have seen over the last 9 tournaments.
Yeah, sure. So you're absolutely right. The women's tournament took about 60 years or so to actually come into fruition. But now that we actually have some momentum behind the women's tournament, we've actually seen a lot of progress. So viewership has risen pretty substantially, but also media coverage of the tournament has also risen pretty substantially as well. And then just general popularity around the tournament in a global nature has also come to fruition as well. So we're seeing an increased viewership from regions such as Asia, Middle East, North Africa, Europe, Latin America. So the game has really exploded in popularity. And of course, that's come with enhanced media coverage as well.
So how has that translated into sort of the economic picture? I mean, you talk about this is a global game. Europe, of course, has always kind of been leading the way, at least when it comes to soccer. But we've seen incredible growth in places like Asia.
Yeah, I think that really just speaks to how global the game has become. Not necessarily just for the women's tournament, but also for the men's as well. We've seen this rise in global popularity around the sport of football. And I think when you're thinking about just the Women's World Cup specifically, close to 50% of the viewers are actually coming from Asia and the APAC region, and a lot of those viewers are coming from China and coming from India. So I think, again, it really just speaks to how global the game has become and how global the reach and the popularity of the sport has transitioned over the course of the last couple of decades or so.
So let's talk about the business side of things, because there's obviously, sort of the teams that have traditionally done really well, but also where that viewership is coming in from. How has that changed the sponsorship picture?
Sure. As far as where the viewership is coming from, again, it's global in nature, but that also means that you're getting more global types of sponsors. So we're seeing sponsors come not just from the traditional powerhouse regions like Europe and South America, but we're also seeing more sponsorships coming from Asia and the Middle East as well. We're also seeing some Caribbean sponsors come in and sponsors some of the matches and some of the individual teams coming out of the region. So again, it's not just global popularity and global viewership. We're also starting to see the business side of the sport become more global as well.
So one of the interesting numbers I thought you point out in your report is how these media rights deals have been packaged. They have been bundled together traditionally, which has made it difficult to sort of value what the women's side is. This year, the approach has been a little different. What does that tell you about how unequal the valuations are, despite more eyeballs being on the game?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Historically, FIFA has actually bundled the media rights for the Women's World Cup and the Men's World Cup together. And to your point, that's made it very, very difficult to actually ascertain the commercial value of the Women's World Cup versus the men's tournament. This year, things are being done a little bit differently. So they've unpackaged the men's rights against the women's rights. But there is a very wide disparity between the media rights generation that has come out of the women's tournament as opposed to what the men's tournament has generated as far as revenues. So for the men's tournament, the men's media rights were a little over $3 billion. For the women's, we're just around $300 million. So there's this huge gap between the media rights revenue generation, despite 2 billion eyeballs watching the Women's World Cup tournament. So the pay gap between the men and women has been very apparent now that the media rights have been unpackaged and unbundled.
So what's that next step to change that? If you think about sort of this long fight that has been going on within the game, at least on equal pay, talk about the media rights, now that they have been unbundled, we have seen how unequal things are. What is that next step to maybe narrow the divide?
Yeah, I think it really comes back to more investment going into the women's game. We spoke about sponsorships turning more global in nature, and hopefully that attracts new and maybe even youthful or innovative sponsors to eventually come into the women's game. 2 billion eyeballs, that's a lot of potential commercial value coming out of the World Cup. And hopefully, again, that means more sponsorships coming from different areas of the world and new investment following up into the Women's World Cup tournament. So that would be one way to kind of narrow that gap. But even if we do get a little bit more progress on that front, there's still a very wide disparity that needs to be narrowed over time.
And finally, Brendan, there's an interesting calculation here that you have put together in your report to determine who could potentially win this year's Women's World Cup. What is that pointing to, and how do you get there?
Yeah, so we basically took a page out of our economics and financial markets toolkit to actually predict the World Cup winners, and then also the teams that could advance out of the group stage. And it really comes back to econometrics, really just using economic indicators, other types of indicators to predict an outcome like GDP growth or inflation. And we basically just used that same methodology for the women's football tournament. So we took some indicators like the strength of some of the teams, the team rankings, the goals scored, the goals allowed. And we basically use this econometrics type of framework to come up with a winner. Now, our winner is, of course, in an unbiased opinion, the U.S. team. They score very well on many of the indicators that we include in our model. But we also have some dark horse teams as well, like Colombia and some of the Latin American teams that could do very well over the course of the tournament as well. So really, it comes down to using the econometrics approach, using the financial market analysis toolkit that we have, again, to predict a winner and teams that could do very well over the course of the World Cup.
Do you still feel confident in that prediction, despite the U.S. team's performance so far? I think a lot of people are probably pretty excited that the U.S. is still coming out on top.
I'm still confident. You can certainly make an argument it's been a bumpy road in the early parts of the tournament, but maybe this will be a little bit of a wake-up call for the U.S. team, and maybe they can draw on their experience and hopefully get the job done in the later rounds of the tournament. So still pretty confident.
Wells Fargo Vice President, International Economist Brendan McKenna. It's good to talk to you today. Appreciate the time.